And Marcel, how would you like to run it? Because usually you have very good structures for this kind of thing.
Yes, good morning, or whatever day of time of the day is amongst the audience. Well, I was expecting Steve to be here. Is Steve here? It doesn't
Steve
show.
is here, yeah. Steve has raised his hand.
Because the idea will be that he start and I will introduce the session then. I would like to do it in two sections. The first section, more overall view of the city, metropolitan area, and then specific issues on sort of water supply, energy, and affordable housing as the second part. So shall I leave Steve to start the meeting?
Yeah, Steve could say something about the series and the context, and then perhaps just a very short, brief one would do, and then yeah. So I'll leave it to run it. Steve, we might just well start because I think people are still here, so we might just well start, and people are free to go and load up their coffee cups and so on, right? So, Steve, you're muted now.
Steve, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Good morning from the UK. My name is Steve Denman. I'm a research associate at the Martin Centre. I'm one of the conveners of the AUM Symposium series. On behalf of the Scientific Committee and my fellow conveners of AUM, I'd like to welcome you all to this online global workshop, session 5, on critical issues under rapid urbanisation. For those of you joining us as the first session of the day, just raise a few quick points on the format and timing of this session. First, as you're aware, this is a global conference being broadcast across multiple time zones. The entire proceedings are being recorded and colleagues can watch the proceedings afterwards via our AUM webpage. Secondly, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your Zoom hand and be invited to ask the question live, or you may also use the chat function and I will relay the question to the relevant speaker. And thirdly, as we are very time limited today, I'd ask all speakers to keep to time and to allow for questions afterwards. And for this session, we're joined by Marcel Ekeny as discussant. Marcel is a professorial fellow at Churchill College and an emeritus professor of land use and transport studies at the University of Cambridge. He is also one of the conveners and members of the Scientific Committee of the AUM series. And I'll end there and hand over to Marcel and ask him to introduce the session in more detail and the individual speakers. So over to you, Marcel.
Thank you, Steve. As I mentioned before, I would like to divide the session in two parts. The first part, I will invite Professor Bhargav Raghavendra, who is, I'm saying Bhargav Adhvaryu, who is a professor of architecture at Modi School of Management at Ahmedabad University. He's a civil engineer and planner specializing in urban planning and transport system. He holds a PhD from Cambridge, and he will be talking about public transport accessibility level. The next speaker will be Professor Darshini Mahadevia, professor at Ahmedabad University and Associate Dean of the Art of the same university. She is an architect planner with a PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Her interests are very wide-ranging, from equity issues to sustainability, and has a lot of publication. She will be talking about sustainable mobility, especially for low-income people in the periphery of Ahmedabad. And finally, in the first part, Professor Amit Patel is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He's an architect planner and he has held a PhD from George Mason University in the USA. He will be talking about network of slums and health in the slum, and in the light of the pandemic, which is very topical at the moment. So starting with Bhargav, I will ask him to add any other issue about his CV and then start with his presentation. Bhargav. You are not, you are on mute.
You're muted.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, hello world and
Yeah.
greetings.
Good.
So wherever you are, thanks for the introduction. I don't wish to add anything more because we have 6 people lined up today, and we'll sort of do it very quickly and then open it up for discussion. So am I allowed to share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. Just a minute. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Is my screen? Okay.
Yes, it's all, yeah,
Okay.
excellent.
So I'm going to talk about public transport accessibility and its implication on planning policy in general. So the talk is divided into sort of 4 sections. First, a quick introduction to the Indian context and what are the things that come to mind when we're dealing with issues in India. Then a quick overview of the Patel methodology. Then some work that has been done to apply Patel, which is public transport accessibility levels, and its mapping to Indian cities. And then the bulk of the discussion is, possible applications to planning policy. So whenever we talk about the Indian context, the key message I want to give is that we have a huge proportion of people relying on public transport. And as you can see from these pictures, it is overstressed like any other public service system in India. And obviously this is due to rapid urbanization. There is a lot of overstress. However, at the same time, we would like our public transport systems to be well functioning. And primarily because it gives the lower income people to be part of a bigger labor catchment, and they can increase their income. Sort of mobility improvement leads indirectly to increasing their incomes. So, and of course, we know that the resources have limited, as we discussed in the previous sessions. So we are a poor country and we have limited resources. Given that, what is it that we can do as a starting point? So with that in mind, I'm sort of using this Patel as a tool to achieve the broader objective of trying to improve our public transport systems. So the sort of key take-home message here is that when we talk about India, on the one hand, we have rapid urbanization, which is overstressing the public transport systems and other systems as well. As against, we are a resource, we are a poor country. So, these two are 2 critical things to keep in mind in the Indian context, and more so even probably in the other developing cities of the world. So moving on to the method itself, a very quick historical overview. This method of mapping and measuring public transport accessibility was first started in the London borough of Hammersmith and Fulham in 1992. And over the years, then it got adopted by TfL, which is Transport for London, as a standard method for measuring and mapping public transport accessibility. And apart from London, there are uses in other cities of the UK, US, even Australia, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. So essentially, the method is quite simple and straightforward. So we take a study area or a city, and we have a specific geographic boundary, and you divide the city or the study area into some grid cells. Now, the grid cell is a function of the amount of money you have to put it very simply. So it's like a resolution of a picture or a camera. If you have more money, you can go for the DSLR, and if you want to zoom in and so on and so forth. But for this purpose, we found a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid to be sufficient to take macro strategic decisions at a city level. So once we have this grid, then each point, the centroid of the grid, becomes the point of interest, and that is the starting point. So then a series of steps are sort of carried out. So in context of this points of interest, we have service access points or station access points. So there's a network of routes and there are bus stops and all that. So how accessible these points are from that bus stop, then we can calculate the walk access time, the frequency of buses will give us the waiting time and so on. And after a series of calculation, each dot, each POI, which is point of interest, gets an accessibility index, a numerical value. And then using a thematic mapping tool in any GIS software, we can produce very lucid visualization of this accessibility. So this is how it would look like. So this is now graded into a color scheme. We can apply we can even do a monochrome if that's necessary. So the blue in this case is the poorest and red is the highest. And the one sort of innovation we did here in applying here was to change the AI values to integers or whole numbers. So that makes more sense for policymakers. When we say a point of interest has index of 4, it's not an arbitrary number, but it's an equivalent doorstep frequency, which means 4 buses per hour or bus every 15 minutes, so to say. So that number is relatable and you can calculate the city average and so on. So this is the mapping output that we get as the first step of measuring and mapping the public transport accessibility. So getting sort of inspired by that London study, we started this work in Ahmedabad in 2014. Then it was done on Surat in 2016. Then 2 more cities were done 2 years later, Pune and Bangalore. And then in 2002, last year, we did Lucknow, Hubli, Dharwad, and Raipur, Naya Raipur region. And we are not getting into details, but each city presented its own different context, and you have to adapt or tweak the model a bit here and there. But ultimately, given the simplicity of the whole calculation, given that basic data, it is able to, I mean, we were able to produce this sort of visualizations. So now coming on to the main topic of discussion. What can we do with these maps? I mean, the question is, so what? I mean, okay, these are pretty looking maps. Now, when we try to interface that with the planning data, so we have population density, job density, land use map, all future, base year and future, land suitability maps, environmental protection maps, and of course the master plan. All these could be quickly overlaid given the sort of GIS framework and can help us take some or fine-tune our planning decisions. It sort of provides a decision support system to the planners, if you like. So just going over the possible applications. The first one is obviously you can prioritize the PT investments, which means that if you overlay this with the population density, so you see the bars which are the z-axis is the population density. So we can clearly see that there are areas which are high or tall bars, but the color is on the lower side. So low public transport accessibility. This is where you can focus or channelize the investment. And like a lot of, I mean, even in the UK, they had this TIF, which is Transport Investment Funds. So every city has a fixed budget year on year to be able to pour in transport. So this becomes a quicker way to sort of prioritize budget and do the phasing of the investments. A similar approach can be tried by overlaying the Patel map with the job density. So in a particular case, there was some data available, not very fine resolution, but at a grid level, for we can make the job density map and overlay it with the Patel map. The transparency has not come through very well. So the idea is here we can see that there are clusters which are high concentration of job, but are not accessible well by public transport. So again, making the point that you can prioritize your investments better in terms of public transport. The other application that I see possible from this is, informing the parking, the TOD, and the NMT connectivity. So areas which have high public transport or PTELs can be a good candidate for parking reduction. And some cities have tried that. A few years back, I sort of heard Jan Gehl, a famous architect planner for Danish, saying that every month or so they reduced a couple of parking blocks from parking slots from the city center, and no one would notice. So gradually this has done and has been implemented. If you look at the peripheral areas in most cities that we studied, the PTEL was either poor or on the medium side. So these also could become good candidates for the park and ride locations where long distance commuters could park and then ride into the wherever there is a good accessibility of public transport. The other innovation we were able to implement in one of the cities was micro PTEL maps. So as I said again, at the strategic level, at the city level, a square kilometer grid which had one centroid, one POI was good enough. But if you have to take surgical decisions, you need to go a bit deeper. And if you subdivide this grid into two, you get 4 and so on. And if you do 100 by 100 meter grid, you get 100 points of interest. And we tried that for a sample area because it was too much resource intensive in terms of computing and all that. If we take a 30 by 30 meter grid, we get about 1,000 points of interest, and we get a very fine resolution of the PTEL map. And those can be useful when we are talking about on-street parking, which varies by location. It's a complex problem, on-street parking. It could be used in better delineation of the transit-oriented development zones, because if you overlay this sort of map with the cadastral map, which we have the plot information, ownership, and all that, we get more a tailored buffer to the TOD as against the current system of just taking 200 meters on either side of a transit line. So plots are not cut properly, and some of them who should not benefit from TOD start getting benefited, and people who are really near may not be, and so on. So this gives you a better surgical tool to be able to decide the buffer line of the TOD. And also, as we know, the first and last mile connectivity to any PT system is controlled by the non-motorized transport. We can take more focused intervention when designing the footpaths and so on and so on. So the third application we found for PTEL would be locating the social and affordable housing. So in a lot of cases, the city government has its own land owned by them, where they would declare or put social housing. And in a lot of cases, we have seen, and Professor Darshini would probably touch on those issues later on, that there is a mismatch between where people are wanting to live, especially the urban poor, and where their jobs are. So that can be avoided if you have a city level accessibility map in which you can cite your own locations. There are some developers, private real estate developers, who are supplying affordable housing, which is slightly on the lower side, but still market rates. They could benefit from these sort of overlays. And of course, some cities are into urban renewal, where they do infill, housing infill. So which could be horizontal or even vertical, underutilized FSI. So for these decisions to be able to be more surgical, a micro PTEL map would be very useful, is what we are thinking. Coming on to the mobility of urban poor, we again did a study in 2019 about public transport accessibility in Ahmedabad, and we overlaid the slum locations on the PTEL map, and we found that even most of the slums are in the red areas or high PTEL, but it doesn't necessarily translate to higher accessibility. Why? Because these people have variable job locations. They are street vendors, they are construction workers, their offices, they don't go to office like most people do. They are variable, and therefore there should be a better sync between the PT system and their job location. So that is what came out from this sort of study. And of course, one of the key things that one could do is that if cities have LUTI models in place, and this is an example of Simplan, which I had worked with Professor Richini a long time back. So there is at the core of that is an input, which is dwelling units or the floor space and the employment. So these, if we have a zonal map, which are each zone is a modeling input, we can overlay some sort of a future PTEL map if we have committed transport schemes, some project reports and all that, and fine tune the LUTI inputs to the model for a future year. So that, and the last sort of application I see is scenario planning. So cities without LUTI models can also still use this sort of mapping, where this is an example where you, in Lucknow, where you overlay the future PTEL map on the future DP. And as we see here, there is a huge mismatch. They have proposed a huge development, but it is almost zero in terms of public transport accessibility. So these sort of mismatches can be taken care of as early as possible before people start building things. And another case of scenario planning where the transport part was very strong and much more committed than the land use plan. So that can be used as a starting point, and we can adjust the development based on some other scenarios. And this is still to be worked out, but as someone mentioned in one of the presentations today, Frank Zhao, I think, that the smart city concept still lacks clarity, and I agree with that. But in terms of the dashboard kind of ideas that have been promoted, we could use this as a dynamic decision-making tool. When new routes are added, you get the PTEL map updated, and it's like a front end for the decision makers, which they could use to fine-tune their decisions. So just to conclude, I think in Indian cities do lack a strong legacy of data collection in a systematic way. However, I think given the limited data availability and the resources, as demonstrated, PTEL could be a potential starting point in terms of the public transport, which could significantly impact the planning policy decisions. If a city has LUTI models, it can be used to plug into that. And overall, in the newest smart city mission from Government of India, that is still to be explored in detail, but I think it's a thought worth exploring further, that how can that fit into the bigger picture of the smart city planning. So keeping it short, I would probably end here, and any quick questions, clarifications, or we can take it at the later as the host suggests. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bhargav. That's very interesting presentation. I think we'll carry on straight into the next presentation, and then the three papers presentation will be discussed together. So I would like Professor Darshini to explain her presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I was muted. Let me take this opportunity to thank the organizers to invite me to this new world that I'm introduced to, the world of the modelers. On what Bhargav presented today, I think we sit in the same building. So whenever we are going to meet next after COVID reopening of the university, I'm going to tell him to disaggregate his model and put in the concerns that I'm going to talk about today. Because I think in many of the transport models which are sort of run, and even probably Bhargav's model, there is one people is most likely to be divided by income, but we, in Indian context, we need to be further disaggregating the mobility patterns that get put into the model firstly by gender, not just by income, as well as gender. So we would have much more groups of population that get reflected in such kind of modeling. In my today's presentation, I have a problem with my screen. Do you mind if I just show this, because when it's full screen, I have a problem. So my presentation I'm bringing in from two angles, and it also brings in my research work that I've done over time. I've worked on both housing sector, housing to the urban poor, and also looked at transport sector. In our last low carbon mobility research on urban transport that we did, we actually proposed that we need to look at studies in more bringing in, when we bring in the data of household level or individual level mobility, travel patterns, we need to disaggregate by the social groups, and we need to represent them in our models. Otherwise, what we get is a very a model that doesn't really speak to the Indian reality. So it's in this context we developed this and I've circulated the papers to the organizers. So when we talk about largely sustainable mobility, talk about more physical mobility, but physical mobility has a very strong connection with other social and economic mobility, and it's really important in the context that we are in India. Sustainable mobility, and then in sustainable mobility concept, we bring in an external element of what we call social inclusiveness. But many of the models that are run, they don't really try and do that to bring in the various concerns of mobility. For example, women's mobility in our Indian context, and it's global phenomena, but it's more in the context of global South, that they have their trips are largely trip chaining, so they do perform multiple tasks simultaneously. And in that context, the kind of transport models which are origin destination based models don't sort of bring in the nuanced understanding of mobility of a large half the population in Indian cities or in global cities of the global South. Secondly, the sustainable mobility has focused largely on density, diversity, design, and what's called about 6 Ds. Public transport and non-motorized transport promotion, but non-motorized transport is always seen as the last leg connectivity, whereas we still have significant population which can't even afford public transport. And I think in Bhargav's model, we need to bring in people who can't actually afford public transport. The other sort of models of arguments about sustainable mobility on heavy dependence on technology is there, but I'm focusing more on the social dimensions of mobility. The second stream of research that I bring into this discussion, and in the current 2 research papers that are out, one I have circulated, and one which is going to come up in housing studies as a part of a special issue, is linking transport and housing together, and that's what I'm going to bring some sort of flavor of the city that I live in, and there are much larger questions to ponder based on this case that I'm going to present. The land markets, on the other hand, have decided where the poor are going to be located, and it's just not a phenomenon in India alone. It's not a phenomenon in my city alone, but that's a phenomenon observed in large parts of the global South cities. There could be variation. For example, in South Africa, the entire public housing which is state supported tend to be far out into the peripheral areas. And in, say, for example, a case study that is part of our joint research it's far away from the very celebrated bus rapid transit system of Johannesburg. And so to me, a lot of the transport model tend to look to address how to bring people into the public transit network and how to make this shift from private motorized transport to the public transit, but we still have a very large segment of population which is just not mobile. And that lack of mobility is much larger if you look at the women among the low income communities. So I'm going to present to you a situation that what has happened in many of the developing cities of the global South, that gradually either the market pushes the low-income populations on the periphery, because that's where the land are cheap, or in, at least I can say in Indian context, there have been many infrastructure projects, including the public transport projects that Bhargav has shown. The bus rapid transit system in Ahmedabad, for example, has led to a lot of evictions. City beautification projects have, but even the public transport projects have led to a lot of evictions, and then people get dumped onto the periphery. And this is the photograph of one of the periphery where people were dumped. They are displaced from multiple projects, a large riverfront development project, and all other infrastructure projects of the city. They are under the heavy power tension lines, and I don't have that picture, but they are next to the largest garbage dump of the city. And it's here that they sort of carry out their even economic activities. This is the last picture. This one that I'm showing now is a very famous junk food or street food of, I mean, depending on what one looks at it. I call it junk food, but this is a very popular street food of Ahmedabad. And it's made in many of such settlements. And I don't know how this fellow who is so far away from the transport line and from the city going to carry on the business, but it seems that there's no other option. And so we have large number of self-employed who are dumped onto the urban periphery, and then they get into a negative spiral or a vicious cycle of poverty. Ahmedabad is a 6.5 million city, and this is part of the case study that we have done. I want to just briefly just introduce you to the spatial geography of the city. This is the proposal of Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority. That is 2021 plan. Something that is interesting, that you see a circle, which is a ring, which is about 1 kilometer wide. No, 2 kilometer wide ring. This is called the affordable housing belt, which has been now formalized within the development plan of the city. And you see the transit corridors, which are not matching with. So when you putting affordable housing on the periphery, and I think this is what Bhargav was talking about, and he has shown other city cases also. And this is a good example of how in a planned way, or in a development plan, there's no integration of transport and housing. And as a result, what we have is people getting dumped onto the periphery. And these are two case studies that we have written in that article. So we're looking at the larger picture of how the city's development happens, how the neoliberal paradigm has shifted housing onto the markets, and in which then dumps poor on the periphery, or the state comes in under the neoliberal paradigm of cities as engines of growth, carries out massive investments in infrastructure, and then displaces people onto the periphery, and state dumps them onto the periphery in the kind of living conditions we have. And what we see in Indian cities is both state and markets have dumped poor onto the periphery through either market processes or authoritarian state actions implemented to planned projects. And this is a new kind of housing that comes up on the periphery. And we took up 2 sites. I don't think we need to go. And we picked up 2 sites carefully. One is a state-supported housing, which is the social housing. And another is a private housing with private sectors, but that's with some state subsidy and involvement of a non-governmental organization. Here we see that this is a very, it's a sort of bottom-up study, primary survey of people who moved from the central parts of the city onto the periphery, but they continue to have their jobs in their previous locations. And you see that the sites are far from the public transport. You can see the BRTS route, and there's a proposed metro route, and the sites that are there are quite far from the proposed transport routes. Same thing is with another site that you see is far from the public transport routes. There is what we find, and I'm going to sum up by, if anybody would want more details about it, I can talk about it. So what we did is we studied about life on the periphery because of very poor accessibility. And there are multiple aspects of accessibility. First thing that we find in this low-income communities, either inhabiting the social housing or inhabiting a private housing, which is called affordable housing in India today, the costs and inconveniences of travel have increase. And as Bhargav was saying, there's no last leg connectivity. Even if somebody intends to take a public transport, there's no last leg connectivity. And even for last leg connectivity, because they are not integrated modes of transport, what happens is that one pays for paratransit for the last leg connectivity and then pays for the public transport, and the cost of transport increases exponentially for the people who are put on the periphery. Many have had job constraints and economic stress, especially when we found when women had just dropped out of the labor market. And in low income households, when women drop out, it has a potential of pushing the family below poverty line. The children have dropped out from the schools. It has also been seen that some people, so some members of the family stay somewhere else in the 5 days or 6 days a week to work and come back to this house only on Sunday or the off day. And so the families have got separated out. And especially many of these sites, which are new sites because they have emerged as the ghettos of the urban poor, there is increased crime rate, and women consistently have reported of not moving out, not going out in the evenings after it gets dark. And as a consequence of that, they have also dropped out of the labor market. So they've dropped out of the labor market because accessibility is poor, and they've dropped out because of lack of safety and the freer. And there is a general sense of increased crime on the periphery. And lastly, what has happened is that the urban poor as that agency for change, they've got fragmented, thrown in different rehabilitation sites. So their social networks, the community organizations, etc., have got splintered. And in the new site, they are at loss. So there is no way they have a sense of an agency of change. And this is very damning because in terms of long-term prospects of improvement in the quality of life and future social and economic mobility, these are going to hinder that process of change. And the result is that there's lack of mobility and freedom, and there's longer term household and social economic mobility is being compromised. In all our studies, we find repeated theme of safety and crime, because these are underserviced area, there's lack of social cohesion. And in many places, we have found that crime has taken the place of livelihood. And I'm going to end very soon.
Darshini, we are running out of time, so if you could.
Okay, so the last two slides are, this is
right,
what,
fine.
and Bhargav also showed this, that we have this, we don't have public transport routes which match with where the location of urban poor, and this is Ahmedabad, but this is Pune, and wherever you see, this is the kind of situation that we have. And so what is the answer? Even if we look at housing and transport nexus, do we start with the housing strategy, or do we start with the transport strategy? Do we have transit-oriented development as an answer? To me, which when there is further discussion, maybe I would discuss that as to why that may not be the case. What we need to look at is that we need to mainstream the SDGs in the transport sector decisions that we would take, because transport is going to be very important means for even addressing climate change. And so we need to look at things in more holistic manner, integrated manner, than just address things sectorally. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Darshini. I think it's a very interesting point that you are making, especially the idea of the importance of mobility for social cohesion and inclusivity. We'll come back to this for some discussion, but may I call Amit, Professor Amit Patel, to present his presentation. Thank you. Amit, I think you are yes, now, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this and inviting me here. I'm going to talk about if we conceptualize slums and cities as networks, what are the implications for urban planning and public health? So this is more a thought experiment, and I'm going to present it in the context of slum health in the current pandemic situation. But I believe that there is a wider implication for long-term urban planning and for public health if they are separable. So let me jump into this. So I borrowed this, Professor Betty is here, so I don't need to talk too much about this, but I borrowed this idea from New Science of Cities, where all of this work is enshrined. I suggest, team, that you keep this next to Bible as well. And the key idea here is that cities have been long conceptualized as places in space, and maps have dominated our imagination when it comes to urban planning. But this is not just mere place in a space. There are networks. This is a system of networks and flows. Networks could be physical, but they're not just physical networks. They're like street networks, but they could be social networks, and they do not manifest necessarily geographically. In this conceptualization, both people and places are nodes and linkages simultaneously. So to give you an example, a seller and a buyer, which are people, could be nodes, and market is a node that links between the two, and market could be a physical place. In the other context, work and home are physical places, but a commuter is the link between the two. So the people becomes linkages. So this is the kind of context in which we are talking about this. So I'm thinking about how do we organize our imagination of cities in slums in particular, as multiple overlapping and interacting networks. And if these are the principles of New Science of Cities, there is a parallel tradition in urban health where there are principles of slum health and urban health in general. In there, the proposition is that urban planning should be visualized as a preventive medicine, because how we design our cities determines quite a lot of our health outcomes collectively and individually. So in this view, epidemiology is not just physical, it's eco-social, and that's where the network comes into the play, that a disease spread is not just physical phenomena. Who meets whom, and they might not be connected physically, is all matters. And people are very much part of the intervention. So if you just say mandatory mask and we don't rely on people, of course, it's not going to work. In slum health, another principle is that urban management is an adaptive process. So we learn from how things have worked, has not worked, and so on. Now, this is quite overlapping with the complexity science and New Science of Cities in terms of how we visualize cities and systems. And four of the things that stand out for me is that in both traditions, the collective action is getting a central role. There is a heightened attention to new types of data and indicators. We have quite a lot of urban measures that would have not existed just 2 or 3 decades ago. And then cities are viewed as complex systems, and they both call for bottom-up approaches to planning and public health. So those are like kind of bases for me to propose that we integrate New Science and slum health together. And in that kind of visualization, what I think is that there are 4 key networks that are important. The first one is networks within single slum communities. The second is networks between slums and non-slums. Third is how the goods and services flow in the city. And finally, cities are not closed systems. So there are migration networks that we need to consider. City, in that sense, expands to the regions from where it draws people. So if we visualize these places as networks, there is one really nice example from Sao Paulo where these networks were mobilized. So slum residents really rely heavily on each other when there is a catastrophic events or emergencies like COVID-19. And they serve as social capital. We have seen this in microfinance context where this social capital has been used for lending and borrowing and so on. But our public health responses and urban planning has rarely recognized these networks as a resource. And in this context, you can see the top photograph. These are 400 new street precedents in in one of the favelas, Paraísopolis in Sao Paulo. They self-organized themselves. They hired their own doctors, ambulance, that's the second picture, and eventually demanded for the rights from the city government. So that's the kind of networks we are talking about. And they are absent when we talk about these things just with maps and so on in our discussion. And then this imagination of cities, slums and non-slums, not only in science, in art, you can see the photograph by a famous Unequal Scenes project by Miller, that they are conceptualized as two separate systems, but no city would function if we don't see them as part of one integral system. So slums and non-slums are not that separable. And when we suggest policies like lockdown, what it does is it affects livelihoods for poor people who live in slums, but it also affects non-slum communities equally by cutting off their supply for goods and services that cannot work. For example, like waste collection in many of the Indian cities where slum dwellers play a key role. So to me, this is a false dichotomy of slums and non-slums. The system is just a single system and it's made up of several networks, and one key network is employment. The slums and non-slums interact very much if you think about domestic help or supplies like food and vegetables. So this is one example from Ahmedabad at the lower left photograph, where a program called Vegetables on Wheels was launched, and which is a perfect example of how a network was utilized. An NGO, the local city government in non-slum and slum dwellers come together, which kind of serves a common purpose for all of us. And that's, I think that's one good example of how networks can be utilized. The third network that I talked about is of goods and services. And this is like Uber Eats, there's a company called Swiggy that planned to deliver millions of meals to people in India when we were under the strict lockdown for 21 days in March. So this was yet another example of how physical networks and the communication networks, which is like Uber Eats, which is a decentralized system of knowing where the demand is, where the supply is, the kitchen and the restaurant, is used to meet with an emergency. So this is another example of how the services could be delivered using the networks. And then finally, if you look at the city as a closed system and come up with lockdowns where migrants are not allowed to leave, that's what has created people to a situation where people have walked hundreds of kilometers. As you can see in this photograph, it became the news everywhere. But cities are, of course, not a closed system. People come to the cities and they are migrants and they still remain connected with their origins. And if you think about the pandemic, they have the dependent population waiting for them in the origins, as well as their inability to sustain in a lockdown situation when they lose livelihood. So these are kind of issues when we take a look at city as a network made up of migrants coming from different parts of the country. We will look at our measures differently, and we might not even propose such a measure in the first place. So what are the implications of such a view? If we take a traditional view, we of course come up with, like, if you look at slum as a place, we think about containment zones and geographic quarantine and draw boundaries around them and say nobody can live this place. But if you look at social network view of a slum, then that becomes a resource. And we can say that how can we mobilize this resource to fight with this pandemic? If we take slums and non-slum as disconnected and segregated places, we will do heavy-handed policing of slums, and there is a potential for blame making, that these are the super spreaders and so on. If we look at employment networks instead, where slums and non-slums interact, we would rather think of contact tracing and say, a person from a slum goes to work in the nearby apartments in 20 different households. Now that can be useful to model the disease spread, that can be used to curb the disease spread. And that's a very different view as opposed to physical quarantining, which is of course not a real wall. You can't really stop people to not go to work and do things. So these are some of the examples. When we look at city as a closed system, migrants are forcefully kept in the city versus how do we safely take them back to their origins and ask them to self-quarantine. That's the kind of idea behind this. So in the interest of time, I'll stop at that and say that this paper is a think piece, is published in Cities and Health. Anyone interested, I've shared it with the organizers and looking forward to hear your thoughts on this view of cities. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Amit. That's very, very interesting. I completely agree on these connections between networks within the slum and between places. Very, very interesting discussion. We'll have a few minutes for, 10 minutes for discussions. And I will start by saying a few words for clarification. I would like to hear from Bhargav, what is the system of public transport in India? How is provided? Is it all a state provision or it is a private provision? And how does it work? Who plans that? Do you have regulations about the plan and the public transport? Because that is has a lot of implication about planning. And also the question of fares. Are they flat fare or distance-related fare? Which also connected also to Darshini presentation. So, Bhargav, can you reply?
Yeah. So usually in Indian cities, the urban local body or the municipal corporation is responsible for providing the public transport. So what they usually do is they will have a bus service, and the lacuna is provided by the sort of private market in terms of auto rickshaws and chakras, which is intermediate public transport. So these two together basically take care of their needs. In some cases where the city is not self-sufficient to be able to generate funds to have its own system, the state provides some sort of subsidy to be able to operate, which is operated by the state. So this is the way it is operated. The regulation in terms of fare and all that, it is up to the local urban body, which is made of the elected people to decide the fares, and it is stage wise. So 2, 4, 6 kilometers, the fare would change. And it is usually much cheaper, the pure city bus system. The BRTS has slightly higher rates because it provides a higher level of service. So these are the, quick answers to the questions. If
yes,
is that?
Yeah. I have another question about Darshini presentation. You mentioned non-motorized transport. What proportion of non-motorized transport is in the Indian city, and especially in Ahmedabad? You need to open the microphone.
Sorry, I'm going to answer. Bhargav has to answer that.
Yeah, I had some figure from a past study, but it was 55% was non-motorized. That is slow modes, walking and cycling.
How much?
55.
55. Oh, yeah.
So there are two answers. There are two answers to it. If we look at on an average, it's around half in large cities such as Delhi, Mumbai, the non-motorized transport would be less. But in the second tier of cities, it is between 50 and 60%. But for women, it's 70%, 70 to 80%. They tend to walk. They don't even bicycle in Indian context because of the cultural factors. And hence, the distances they travel are very, very small. And that's where even housing transport nexus come in, because they tend to live near the place of work. And because if they work in the central parts of the city and the land markets are very high, so they tend to live in the informal sector. And till now, informal sector was an accepted part of the city, but in this new process of city renewal and regeneration and massive investments coming, it's this sector that's been evicted out and thrown out of the cities. And that's why women are losing their mobility in large numbers.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. Do I need to answer now, or would you?
There is a question by the audience, which I think is a very interesting address to you, Darshini, which is somebody Saif Siddiqui, who said that what is more sustainable practice, to design transport policies according to housing settlement or housing settlements according to the transport infrastructure? That's a question for you, Darshini.
I think to be able to answer that, both housing and transport require public land. So we need more presence of the state in the urban sector. And then we need to, if we are going to design housing, firstly the transport and then put in housing, what would happen is that there is a possibility of a sprawl, which is also what we would not desire in Indian cities. And if we are going to be making the transition to low carbon cities, we would need to still control the sprawl. And hence, I think I would think firstly about housing. And my problem with finding an answer to the housing is that housing is everywhere in the world, including in India, determined by how the markets work. And markets are not favoring the urban poor. And that's why many of the Latin American cities thought that let poor be pushed out to the periphery and then we'll put in BRTs, as the Bogota has done that way. But I don't think that's an optimum solution. We should probably, and to me, any transformation in the city that needs to be thought of, need to be centered firstly around housing. And I'm hoping Amit is going to agree with me that that would be a starting point for any city transformation and not other aspects of city development.
Well, thank you, Darshini. There is another interesting question for Amit. So have you seen the question, Amit?
If you're talking about question by Pooja, I have answered it in the chat.
Yes.
Okay, yes. So SEVA is an NGO and it partnered with a local government of Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation. So there is a role for the state. And the other thing I was thinking about, Swiggy, the Uber Eats, they cannot deliver the food if the kitchen and restaurant are not allowed to open for this purpose and the delivery people are not allowed to move around. So if you remember the lockdown, that was a heavily policed event, and hence I can see that if the state does not have an active role, it certainly has a passive role of permitting such an initiative. So that's my quick thought on that question.
Good. Well, it has been a very interesting presentation, and we may have more time later on, if depending on how long the presentation of the next set of speaker. So thank you very much for very interesting presentations. So now the second session is concerned with specific aspect of rapid urbanization. And I will start with Professor Raghavendra, who is a professor and director of the Ashoka School of Planning and Architecture at Ahmedabad. He is an architect planner and founding director of a center which is connected with vibrant, efficient network urban settlement. And also he has a PhD from Cambridge. The next presentation will be by Professor Shweta Manchanda, she is an associate professor of School of Architecture and Planning of New Delhi University, and she's an architect with a PhD on environmental design from Cambridge. She will be concentrating on the question of energy use in buildings. And finally, Mr. Raghu, who is a partner at Trilogue, a studio and director of Narayana Rao Consultant Group. He's an architect with a master in design technology from the University of Illinois, and he will be talking about affordable housing. So first, Professor Raghav, so could you comments, please? Could you put your microphone, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon from India. I'm speaking to everyone from Hyderabad, a million-plus city in South India. as Professor Marcial has introduced me, I was a PhD student at the Martin Center between 2002 and 2006. I was examining what people would prefer, would pay for improved water services and so on and so forth. And thereafter, I came back to India. I was an advisor to the government of Andhra Pradesh. And we were working on several important water supply and sanitation projects. And thereafter, I was a professor at the Administrative Staff College of India, which is a national think tank established by the first Prime Minister. And more recently, I've taken up a position as a director of a school of planning and architecture. Also, for the past 3 years, we've established a small research center here in Hyderabad on the future of sustainable cities and so on and so forth. So I'll proceed with my presentation. Yeah. All of us know that, the topic itself for the India theme is about rapid urbanization, and all of us know that India is urbanizing fairly rapidly. And more so in the recent past, we see that the trajectory from 2000 to 2050, we find that, this is the projected trajectory, and we've experienced 20 years as part of this trajectory. We notice that there is fairly rapid urbanization. And the way we are experiencing this, as we can see in the second slide here, is that more and more people are settling down in million-plus cities. In fact, at the moment, more than 40% of India's population is currently residing in the million-plus cities. And on last count, this was about 50+ million cities in India. And India is one of the largest human settlement system in the world, with a network of 8,000 towns and cities and nearly 650,000 villages. So it's very important for a country of India's size, and for a country of for a country such as India to think about the future of its human settlements, and more so in the case of what we are proposing to do in terms of securing water for our human settlements. So here we see that, as I was just mentioning, when we started the last century in 1901, and the only million-plus city was in Calcutta. And from there on, we've actually moved on to a situation where there are 53 million-plus cities, and this is expected to touch 75, and perhaps maybe a decade from now, we could even touch 100 million-plus cities. In terms of what we're doing with water supply, in fact, this is a very high priority of the government to ensure that every household is served with adequate water. And piped water supply, in fact, is a high priority of both the national and state governments, and of course, local governments here. More recently, we have had the National Water Policy in 2012, and also the Jal Shakti Abhiyan, which has a sub-theme of Har Ghar Jal, which is piped water for every house, be that rural or urban. And the larger, it's projected that every household in India would have a piped water connection by the year 2024. A lot of progress has been made here. Also, there is unregulated groundwater extraction in India, because of which the national government has actually promulgated the Model Groundwater Regulation Bill recently in 2017. And we've also entered into a strategic partnership with the government of Israel on water management, desalination, and recycling technologies. More recently, I think for the first time, we've also had the national think tank established by the national government, which is the Niti Aayog, which was in its previous avatar was the Planning Commission. So the Niti Aayog has in fact come out with a competitive framework for every state to develop its own water management policy, and has also developed what is called a composite water management index, comprising various strategies and so on and so forth. There is also mention of what we need to do in terms of securing water for our human settlements in the urban areas. So in terms of what the challenges are, I mean, these are all, these challenges are known to us. Most importantly, we don't have regulation of public water utilities. At the same time, the water supply is intermittent. We do not have a continuous water supply. And also, there are huge energy costs associated with pumping water from far. We'll come to that. And of course, we also have huge losses in our water supply system. In fact, our water supply system has one of the, I would say, in terms of the large water supply systems in the world, ours has a substantively high proportion of water losses. This is as high, estimated to be as high as about 40%. So for every 10 drops of water that go into water supply system, 4 actually don't reach the household because of leakages and so on and so forth. Now, all of us know that India's poster boy cities, which are Bangalore, Ahmedabad, New Delhi, Chennai, Mumbai, and of course a lot of other cities, million-plus cities, they are exhibiting one of the fastest, I would say, growth rates in the world currently. I mean, we're talking about growth rates of 6%, 7%, and 8% of nearly all the million-plus cities in India. And of course, we are growing from where we are, which means there's a lot of catching up to do. But what also is happening here, I mean, these areas that we are discussing here, the city area that can be seen in the third column is actually just the core city area. And we're also showing here the population that was reported in the census 2011. Now, what is happening and what all the cities are experiencing is that with every passing decade, we find that we are going further and further away from cities to secure our water. For instance, Chennai is actually talking about getting water by by trains from another town, and also getting water from another state. And nearly every large city in India is actually going as far as 200 kilometers or 150, 200 kilometers away from its city to secure water supply. So I started my career after my PhD. I just, like everyone else, believe that it makes a lot of sense for us to take our water supply network and establish our water supply network, and the pipe would actually deliver household water security to everybody. But if we look closely at this data, I think we may have to question that wisdom. So why I'm discussing this is because, for instance, if you look at what's happening here, I'm talking about, if you look at one of the columns here, which is annual energy costs on pumping water. Because most of our cities, initially when they started off, we had a water supply through gravity. But as the cities have expanded, we find that we are looking at newer and newer sources, which actually requires a lot of energy to pump water, not through gravity, but by pumping. And we're talking about pumping a lot of water. For instance, now Mumbai is talking about a project where it takes 40 hours for a drop of water from the source to actually come to the city. So this is the kind of complex water supply systems that we are trying to develop, and at the same time we are seeing here that, for instance, the open area per capita of square meters, while, for instance, the United Nations recommends at least 9 square meter of per capita open space. And in fact, it's much more in some of the planned cities in the developed world. But most of our cities, the open area is actually quite less. But we look at 2 cases as part of this presentation. Also, I have presented for the benefit of readers here and, of course, participants, the annual rainfall data that's been secured from the Met Department for the past 10 years. And we also find that if we extrapolate that to the surface area of the city and to the larger metropolitan surface area of the city, there is quite a substantive amount of water that comes to us on an annual basis through rainwater. And if we were to actually develop a system that is able to store some of this, or at least 50% of this, we should be able to secure some of our water concerns, not all of them too. At the moment, the way we are planning our cities, nearly 90% of the surface of our cities is impervious, which means that all the water that falls on our cities is actually going into stormwater, stormwater drains, and then into the sewage treatment plants and so on and so forth. This is actually not going right into the ground. And report after report after report in India tells us that we're extracting much more water than is actually falling, on our cities by way of rainwater. Now, when we look at, I'm only presenting two cases because we don't have much time, but this is, I would say, the scenario in most of the large cities in India. So what we find here is I'm presenting data that's available from the year 1920. So this, if we go back to maybe a couple of slides, the city of Hyderabad was founded in the year, around the year 1600. So the first 300 years or so, the city actually did not go outside its, outside its boundaries to get secure water for itself. And slowly what we find is as the city has started expanding, and when we planned our first water supply projects, nearly all of them were through gravity, which means there are no energy costs to the way we are actually planning our water supply systems. But from 1965 onwards, we find that as the city has expanded, a lot of nearly all the water that is coming into the city is actually pumped to the city and that is resulting in humongous energy costs. In fact, I have been part of studies that have actually revealed to us that nearly 10 to 25% of local municipal budgets in India are actually spent on pumping water because of, I would say, poorly planned cities and regions as well. So, for instance, the most recent source that we have actually tapped into, the river Godavari, is actually 186 kilometers away from the city of Hyderabad. So while this is, while we are going very, very far off, I don't think, we have developed a master plan that has, for instance, a long range plan of say 100 years or 200 years or 400 years that informs us that as we expand, these are the sources that we are going to tap into and ensure that we tap into these sources using gravity and so that the energy costs are reduced. And also, I'm presenting data from Bangalore, for instance, and this is again true of very large cities. This is true of Hyderabad as well. If we look at actual GIS data of what's happening with respect to our green cover, what's happening with our green cover in our large cities, we find a dramatic decrease. For instance, in the year 1973, we find that 68% of Bangalore, for instance, had green cover. And that in the next 4 decades or so has dramatically reduced to less than 14%. So while our city development plans, master plans and development plans are earmarking a lot of spaces for green cover and are also talking about conserving water bodies and so on and so forth, we find that in reality, when we are using GIS and other tools, we find that in the larger cities at least, we find that the green cover and area allocated to water bodies has dramatically reduced. And as we can see in the case of water bodies as well. So the question that I'm asking is, from the cases that we have seen, and this is true of other cities as well. So what exactly is urban infrastructure? What urban water infrastructure? Is it just a pipe? Is it a pipe that delivers water to households? Or is it part of a larger infrastructure that cities must plan with their water bodies, with the green cover and so on and so forth, so that we have adequate open spaces, adequate absorption capacity of the city to not just absorb rainfall, but also help with other livability indicators that I think have very strong correlations with this concept that I'm talking about, which is what permeable cities ought to be doing. So the question is, the answer here, what I'm trying to suggest is that while it is important that we get the pipe water network into cities, we must not and should not ignore basic urban planning principles of ensuring adequate green cover, conservation of water, planning for water tanks and lakes and so on and so forth, so that in the long run, we actually don't end up going 50 and 100 and 200 and 400 kilometers away from our cities. And this in the long run is definitely unsustainable. So while we are actually talking about growth, I would, I would insist that sustainability should also be part of this growth story, and we should be adequately planning in the long range for a water supply. And water supply is, once again, I would like to repeat, I don't think it is just a piped water network and a network that is going to deliver water to the house. Because as we have seen in Bangalore, while a pipe would actually reach every home, but I don't think if you're going to be ignoring urban planning principles, you're going to end up with sustainable cities, because
Yes.
we're going to have large energy costs and so on and so forth.
Raghav,
So
we are finishing. So could you please finish as soon as possible, please?
yeah, I'm finishing. So, I suggest that I strongly recommend that we plan for permeability of cities, and we also we look very closely at the interactions of water supply planning with infrastructure requirements in other sectors, mobility, green cover, conservation of water bodies, and so on and so forth. And I think all of this would result in perhaps more coherent approach where we have one city, one vision, and one plan. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Raghav. Fascinating study. I can sort of add to your research that we have done research here in the UK as well, and we think that permeability is an essential aspect of water provision and also prevention of flooding, because at the moment we have a lot of a hard surface which generates enormous amount of flooding in downstream. So thank you very much. So,
and I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
yes, you
Perfectly
are
audible.
perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world we're all connecting from. Looking at the preceding presentations, which have all been so informative, I am going to deal with a very specific issue, which has which I have been trying to tackle in the professional world, and that is the aspect of technology as a rapid adaptive response to building design and construction. And there are two case studies that I will actually look at. One is on mass urban housing, and the second is an adaptive retrofit in the case of pandemic of large facilities such as exhibition halls, convention centers, and so on. So the first case study is a project known as the Life Mission for the government of Kerala, where we had to provide affordable housing within a period of about 6 to 8 months for across almost 17 odd districts. The first 14 came in the phase 1, and the remaining 3 districts were picked up at a later date. And there were totally almost about 2,500 plus units that had to be provided in this very short period of time. And in doing so, what were the current challenges that we had faced, or we continue to face here in India as we provide housing for regions all across in urban areas, semi-urban areas, and so on. Now, the first is, of course, labor shortage, which we face across different building types, whether it be commercial, industrial, housing, or retail. The second is price escalations of materials and goods. There are issues of approvals and delays due to getting the government approvals. There are shortfalls in design and engineering coordination. There is a hesitation to accept new technologies to address these challenges. And the last is, of course, the accessibility and logistics of construction in remote areas. Especially this was a case in point, this particular project across the state of Kerala, which is the southwestern most region in India, where such housing had to be provided not just in urban areas, but in semi-urban and some even remote rural areas. Now, so the aspect of current modes of construction, which was in situ regular concrete construction, had all of these related issues, and it could not be used as a mode of delivery if the project had to be successful and if the project had to achieve its objectives. So based on a comparison of in situ construction, steel, cold rolled steel construction, precast concrete, and light gauge steel frame, we finally adopted light gauge steel frame as a means to achieve this objective and solve this design challenge and solve the problem. So the second aspect of the challenge, second part of the challenge, was in ensuring that when we adopt this new technology, how do we make it acceptable to the end user? Because the society was coming from a background where the housing has always traditionally been a brick and mortar type of construction. But we looked at what were the challenges that were being faced by such a traditional mode of project delivery. And therefore, how is it possible to adapt the planning, adapt the aesthetics, and adapt the user aspirations to a new technology? So we went back to the drawing board. We looked at the 2-bedroom units, typical 2-bedroom units with kitchen and living and dining. We adopted an area of each unit to be about 500 square feet because it was going to be in the affordable category. And we restricted the each building size to be about 44, 45 or less than 50 units on average. The reason for doing that was, one, affordability was always a point of consideration. The second is that we wanted to keep it mid-rise. The minute that we go for a high-rise construction, we're going to come back to tackling the same problems. So if we were to, as a prototype, design and engineer and construct buildings that are going to remain in the mid-size or mid-height, mid-rise category, we would be able to achieve our objectives. The last part of it was the services, utilities, the parking, the green space, recreation had all to be provided within this particular parameter and within this particular cost consideration. So once we were able to achieve the planning perspective, then we shifted to the construction and the engineering aspect of it, which is what we then looked at the wall construction, we looked at the floor, the slabs, the roofing, the substructure and the foundation. And what we then arrived at was the foundation of the substructure would continue the traditional method of in situ concrete construction, whereas the superstructure is when we actually make the transition to the new technology, which is your light gauge steel frame. The light gauge steel frame is essentially a combination of joists, which are cold rolled, hot rolled, pre-manufactured at the factory, delivered to the site, and only the assembling takes place at site. So it is not labor intensive. It is modular. It is completely coordinated at the design stage itself. It's coordinated at the factory as well. And as a result of which, the delays or the challenges that we face in current modes of construction in India, in the housing sector, are actually alleviated. This type of construction, whether it be pre-engineered or whether it be light gauge steel, is common in retail, in commercial and industrial projects in India. But the housing sector is actually, it's a paradigm shift, and it's a new mode of project delivery, and hence it's important that the prototypes had to achieve those immediate objectives. Then the next challenge was, how do we, when using this new mode of construction, how do we achieve the aesthetics that will still make it look residential, that will still have acceptance from the end user, have acceptance from the authorities, etc. So what you see on the screen here is the base, the core structure, which is your floor framing and your the wall framing, again by using the light gauge steel frame, which is built as joists and channels, and then how we clad that with the fiber cement board on each side. And the foundation, like I spoke about, was going to be a cast in situ pile foundation or footings. So this is then, once we are able to use the wall or the superstructure with the fiber cement board, then we are able to clad it or you finish it in using the acceptable means of residential finishes, whether it be paint, whether it be some kind of a stone cladding, or whether it be kind of any kind of a final finish. As a result of which, we're able to almost marry the new modes of design and engineering in the housing sector. Again, I reiterate the fact that especially in the housing sector, so marry the new modes of design, engineering, and construction with the acceptable means of aesthetics and project, acceptance. The success of this project largely depended on two factors, obviously. At the end of the day, it is the bottom line, whether we're able to achieve the cost consideration and whether we're able to achieve time. And as we did in the initial stages, and we kept evaluating right through the project construction or right through the project handover, was on the aspect of time. And we were able to complete the first set of prototypes within a period of 6 months and hand over for occupation and hand over for all the electrical, the plumbing, and all the other finishes. The cost when we analyzed it at the engineering stage, it worked out to about INR 6 crores. So that kind of works out to about 60 million per building. If you put a dollar, 70 Indian rupee to a dollar, you can work the math. And that ended up being less than if we were to go for a pre-engineered building or if we were to go to a precast concrete structure. And it would be even much, much less than if we go in for a cast in situ or a regular means of construction. So by means of volume, because of the aspect of volume of construction, because of the aspect of the modularity of planning, because of the aspects of the pre-manufacturing aspect of it, and only the assembling of at site, we were able to not only keep the costs down, but also deliver the project and also make it acceptable to the end user. The second case study, where again technology is a tool that we have used in recent times, has come as specifically. It was a very specific case where we had to retrofit large halls or large facilities to treat, in the case of pandemic treatment and isolation. And this one was actually a study that originated in collaboration with Professor Alan Short, Professor Andrew Woods, Professor Shashidhara, and myself, where I was providing the design and engineering support to the team. And what we looked at was that in the case of a pandemic, existing health infrastructure is actually stretched to meet the challenges of treatment and isolation. So how do we use technology to address that problem? So what we realized is that in the case of a pandemic, many of these large halls or large facilities, whether be, like I told you, like sports facilities or convention centers, they are no longer used because people do not congregate there. So we take up those facilities, and they are typically large halls, which with a steel structure, and they have a large volume of space, which is actually a shell in which we can go in, and then we actually use the same concept of steel or pre-engineered or pre-manufactured steel joists, angles and channels, and demountable partitions to create these wards within this large infrastructure. And so if you look at this, that was the visual of one of the halls that were taken up for this particular study and this particular retrofitting. And what we do, you see on the top right of the screen is this particular large hall. And then what you see is the actual planning of that particular space, with typically about 10 or 12 wards, each with its own partition system, each with its own ceiling, and with its own air handling units. Because as we see that many of these facilities are already well ventilated, they are already geared up to take the construction loads because of the type of construction. So it is very, very adept to taking up this kind of a retrofit. And what we did is we can again plan this in a very modular way. And as a result of that, again, the modularity allows for speed, allows for costs to be controlled, and it allows for repetition, and therefore it allows for systems to be easily integrated, whether it looks at exhaust and supply air to retrofit these facilities. So if you look at one particular ward or one particular system, so once we have that shell created within this large facility, we then go in and provide the specific fresh air duct, specific exhaust air ducts. And we used this study by Professor Andrew Woods and Professor Alan Short to plan the airflow such that you do prevent cross-contamination, allow for, again, isolation, and not and also protect the healthcare workers or the frontline workers who are actually manning these particular facilities. So that was actually the again using a combination of technology and engineering to address this particular pandemic specific problem. And then when we look at the overall section of the building, so you look at the visuals on the top as to how the basic frame that is there and how these particular systems are actually retrofitted within that particular existing framework. And the best part of this is that each of these particular interventions are actually modular, they are actually demountable. So post-pandemic, they can actually be removed, they can actually be moved to another location, and it's an extremely dynamic mode of project delivery and construction, which is actually very, very adaptive. So this we had suggested for two projects. There was one project which happened in Pune and one project which happened in my own city in Chennai, and both for the governments. And luckily for us, the pandemic here in India is on the fall right now, and hopefully that we would not be in a situation where we need to deploy this technology more in the coming months. But should something happen in the future, God forbid, we have the capability, we have the engineering done to support any initiatives to augment the capacity of healthcare institutions across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghu. That's a very interesting application of technology to, housing and this pandemic issue. I would like to know if
hello.
Yes, where are you? Very good, Shweta, yes.
Working now.
Are you able to present it now?
Yeah, let me just try.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So I'm Shweta Manchanda. I'm an architect, and my area of work is sustainable design. And I've had the good fortune of working on some technical expert committees on behalf of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency that have been looking at the development of the energy code for residential buildings and other guidelines as well for residential buildings. And I'm going to present some of that work today. As some of the speakers have already pointed out, housing is one of the fastest growing sectors due to India's rapid urbanization. And also it's responsible for some of the highest levels of energy consumption, more so because a lot of the energy consumption comes from air conditioning and expected air conditioning, so to say. So through these studies, I like to showcase how modeling and analytics can very effectively throw light on some of the very pressing issues of urban growth. The next slide, please. Yeah, just next. So the first study is a study of spatial configuration that analyzed housing typologies and urban densities and their impact on the immediate urban environment. So if you go next, just move on to the next slide. While these modeling studies showed that there was a clear advantage of more compact typologies, it also showed there was maybe some drawbacks of advocating very high densities in urban areas for multifamily housing. So while the temperatures may drop with slightly higher densities, so say FSIs of about 2, if we go higher to about 3 or 4, the temperatures, immediate temperatures start increasing, and that could have a detrimental effect on the urban environment, as well as the energy consumption in the housing, which will be directly impacted by the outside temperatures, right? And so it was inferred that possibly they, density and typology had impacts on the, the radiant temperatures and wind flows interactively that impacted the urban temperatures, and the modeling was able to showcase this otherwise, kind of a complex problem. The second study was a study of energy labeling, and this has maybe perhaps paved the way for the current labeling system that has recently been launched. This study reviewed the rating systems in India and identified clear gaps in the addressing of energy efficiency in the housing sector. If you go next, what it proposed was a sort of a tiered approach, considering the socioeconomic status, the socioeconomic structure of the housing in India. It proposed a tiered approach to targeting energy efficiency, whereby more stringent measures may need to be recommended for housing with lifestyles which were more energy consuming. So sort of a baseline for the affordable and the middle income groups, and maybe a more stringent approach for the higher income groups. So if you go next, this sort of paved the way for studies on thermal comfort standards. And just go ahead. A review of analysis of the thermal comfort studies both in India and abroad showed a paucity of research on specifically on housing, and more so in the Indian context. And there were only a few scattered studies that were done in different cities that showed a high degree of variability. So if you can just skim through the other 3 slides. Only recently, a large-scale project has been launched by the government to study the thermal comfort standards in India. And what the review also pointed out was that these studies need to look at characteristics of housing, characteristics of occupants, which are very specific to housing, such as variation in age, living spaces, variation in activity levels, and so on, not to mention the cultural factors and the socioeconomic factors, which the previous study also highlighted. So just go ahead. The last study is a study that was done on photovoltaic panels. And photovoltaic panels are being quite commonly advocated to offset the energy consumption by buildings. However, what this study tried to assess was the impact of the photovoltaic panels on the immediate urban environment. And 3 parallel studies were done. One was a land-based study. Go ahead. And it was using Landsat imagery of photovoltaic panels, and the others complementary studies were simulation based and monitoring based. And all 3 studies pointed out to a consistent increase in the immediate urban temperatures. So this finding sort of throws caution to the widespread prescription of photovoltaics in urban recommendations before further studies kind of clarify this picture. So I won't take too much of time and wrap up. If you can just go ahead to the last slide, Raghavendra, thank you. Just the last slide. I think I just got a selection of studies, and together what I'm wanting to kind of underscore is that there is a need to look into design considerations in detail, whether they are related to planning, lifestyle, or occupant behaviors, or technology installations, before we kind of while we are in this process of formulating the policies for energy efficient growth in the country. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shweta. You went a bit too fast, so I couldn't see many of your slides properly. But I think I got the gist about it. I think what we could do is open now for discussion if there is any questions here. But if we start with Raghav, interesting proposition that we need to have more permeable cities in order to collect water from the places nearby the demand. But in order to do that, Raghav, you need to have also pumping equipment in order to extract the water from the underground. So have you taken that into consideration? Probably will be less energy required for pumping the water locally than transporting. But have you calculated that impact? And the second question, I said, what percentage of the water requirement, the potable, drinking water, can be got from the rainfall in those cities that you illustrated, which I think is an important issue. Raghav.
Yeah, Professor, I would say that rainfall would meet up to about 25 to 30% of the requirement of water in cities. At the moment, the groundwater extraction is completely unsustainable because we are extracting 3 times, 4 times, even 10 times the amount of rainfall falling on our cities and, of course, in and around our human settlements. The water footprint, if I can use that terminology, is such that if 1% of the surface is actually allocated for cities, the footprint is as wide as nearly 41% of the national surface for securing water for towns and cities. Coming to the first question, Professor Marcial, I would want to share that India has actually had a very, very efficient system of planning where we need not have water stored underground to extract it through pumps and so on and so forth to get it onto the ground. We have had a network of lakes, and both natural and artificially created, and these have traditionally been storing water for a long, long time. It is only now, because of unplanned urbanization, that we are encroaching upon our water bodies, upon our green cover, through what I would call thoughtless and single-minded focus on growth. When I said thoughtless planning, long-range planning. What I'm trying to suggest, Professor, through my study and of course the recommendation is that it is not just enough if we get the pipe. We also need to keep our surfaces, our green cover available. Similarly, we need to conserve water through other technologies and other means, and not necessarily have an underground infrastructure of stored water through rainwater. That's something that I'm suggesting. And increasingly, we are going very, very far away from our settlements. And what are we going to do 50 years from now, 100 years from now? So, and we've had cities in existence. For instance, Delhi was founded in the year 700. Most of the cities that we are talking about, the large cities, these were founded in the 15th, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Mumbai, for instance, was founded much earlier. So here we're talking about long-range planning that also closely involves the need to secure water for our towns and cities.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for your reply. I would like to offer anybody who wants to ask. Yes, Raghu?
Actually, I just had one quick thought to add to what Raghav was mentioning, is that he was talking about this whole network of lakes and channels, and those were actually in existence between the 9th and 11th century in the state of Tamil Nadu, where of which Chennai is the capital, during the Chola dynasty. And some of those lakes are actually still in existence today. Many have been encroached upon. So actually, the whole system of water sustainability or water sustainability has a long tradition, and it's only a question of if we can continue that tradition, a lot of issues can actually be solved. Because the government has actually mandated now that mandated rainwater harvesting. They have mandated water recirculation. They have actually mandated rainwater harvesting ponds and percolation pits in building projects and project sites, and especially large infrastructure development. They have also mandated green cover of a minimum of 25% of any large project development. If those are actually implemented, to a very large extent, we will be able to do a significant groundwater recharge and alleviate at least some of the problems.
Good. Thank you, Raghu. I wanted to ask you a question about your presentation, Raghu, because you show that it's a frame system of steel lattices, really, for a facade, isn't it the case? And I wonder how you can perforate that lattice with windows, because you didn't show that very clearly.
Yeah, actually, what happens is that as a means of construction, you build this frame of lattice at every 2 feet, center on center, and in both directions. And where you actually have the windows, if you looked at one of the slides where you had those open pockets, we create a separate frame around where the openings are going to be coming, and the lattice is actually trimmed around those edges, and it is actually framed, and then the windows are fitted in.
All right, that's because in the diagram you show it looks a continuous lattice without any windows. But on the other point, have you looked at the issue of sustainability? Because a lightweight steel construction will not has how you call energy storage, kind of a passive system, which is typical of the concrete or brick building, which has a mass sort of allow you to maintain the temperature variation in a better way. I'm not sure if you have a problem with a lightweight steel construction.
Yeah, it's very, 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 very pertinent, very, very valid point, especially now in our tropical climate. So what we have done here is actually something that actually I should probably add. I left that point out, is that we have rock wool insulation that we have placed within the two layers. So if you have this lattice frame, you have this open area, and you have two layers of cement fiber board on both sides. And in that pocket, we have actually rock wool insulation that takes care of thermal insulation. The second aspect is that this particular type of planning and design is that we have tried to create a lot of cross ventilation and not have continuous doubly loaded corridors for the entire length of the project, for the entire length of the building. So you do have apartments or housing units on both sides of the corridor, but you open it up at places to allow for cross ventilation. But but especially with regard to each unit, we have rock wool insulation within the lattice itself.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, as explained. But it connected with Shweta presentation, I was quite interested to know that there's a lot of air conditioning in housing now, which increase the demand for energy. And that's connect to your design, Raghu. If you do have double stack houses, both sides of a corridor, it's very difficult to have cross ventilation, which may reduce the need of energy for air conditioning. What is your view, Shweta, about having double stack around the corridor for housing rather than cross ventilation in the housing unit? Have you discussed that?
Yeah, I think, the cross ventilation is extremely important. And, when planning for housing, it's possible to, plan open areas around it. So, when we cluster the housing units, it's possible to, kind of create space around the house. So there is, some cross ventilation that's going through. And I think, and especially that's important for, ventilation is important for the kitchen areas and the, the living rooms, because typically, even if the house is air conditioned, it's not going to be centrally air conditioned. It will, the living areas will typically have intermittent cooling. It may have an air conditioning, but it may be switched on or off, and same is with the bedroom. So at other times, when you don't want to switch on the air conditioning, the ventilation is really important. So cross ventilation is one way, single sided effective ventilation is another way. So I think they are all these options are options to be explored. And in Indian houses, it's extremely extremely important. The other thing I wanted to ask Raghu was that Indian houses, there's also a lot of stress on thermal mass, which is inside the house, because that allows you to kind of bear with the swings of extreme heat and cooling. So if one is going for a lightweight construction like cement fiber board, how does one, how is one able to supply that, much needed thermal mass?
I was just telling Professor Michelle about we are actually now looking at within that lattice work is to provide this rock wool insulation within the layers of cement fiber board and increase the thermal mass, increase or give a better U value of the exterior wall. Now, this is actually quite common in the West, where we have a lot of housing which is done with this lightweight drywall construction, as they call it, and they experience a lot of very significant diurnal variations, significant temperature variations between the seasons, and they have actually been able to provide some controlled conditions within the housing units. In our case, we have two challenges. One is, of course, the thermal mass. So we address the aspect of by providing insulation within the fiber boards in the lattice. We are able to address one of those aspects. The other aspect is cross ventilation and humidity, and that is a challenge that we should probably address in the next round of design and engineering that we should do. In the
Thank you very much, Raghu. Thank you. I would like to ask the previous speakers, Bhargav, Darshini, and Amit, if you would like to add anything after hearing all this presentation. Darshini? Yeah, Darshini?
Yeah. You know, I was listening to the last three presentations very carefully, and there's lot more technical experiences available on low-cost housing and so on. As well as I think, how does that intersect with the actual low-income housing demand? Because I don't think what Raghuram was showing is actually low income. We have about 30-40% of the section who can't afford anything in the cities today. So how do we have this crosstalk between energy efficient housing and so on? And to even Raghavendra, when we're talking about city level planning, how do we work together to see that, you know, the locations of low income housing areas are in peripheral areas and contributing to the sprawl, and primarily because land markets are dictating how the plans are going to work. Then how are we going to address this issue and look at them together? And is there any way we can start this conversation in India internally among ourselves?
Thank you. Bhargav.
No, I just thought if there's any questions from the floor, you do that if there is time, but from the other people in the group, if there's any questions.
Yeah, any questions? And Amit?
Yeah, same here with Professor Adhvaryu. If there are questions or reactions to what we presented, I'd love to hear the thoughts on those.
All right. Well, I think we have reached the end of the session, and I would like to thank all the speakers for their very interesting and exciting research that you are all doing. And I think I agree with Darshini at the end is a question of coordination of so many issues here, not only the transport accessibility, but also the water provision and sort of environmental qualities, as well as housing and cross ventilation, and you know, getting the right housing component for the urban poor. I think a lot of ideas, and I completely agree that what we need is more planning, a more integrated planning, rather than independent pieces of transport or housing or whatever it is. So thank you very much, and I will hand it back to whoever it is in charge of the next session, probably. Thank you very much, all of you. Or Steve.
Thank
Steve
you.
is here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martial. Thank you to all our speakers. And thank you for leading a very interesting discussion, Martial, and keeping to perfect time. The next session will start in probably about 5 minutes, just after a short break. The next session is titled The World's Metropolitan Regions, and Dr. Jin will be hosting the next session, so I'll hand over to Dr. Jin.